Okay, we are in the Maimer Basi Legani Tafshin Chaf, and we are in the middle of chapter 6, or after the first paragraph of chapter 6. So we left off with a question here, the opening chapter 6. But just to bring us again back up to speed, we're talking about the second half of the Maimer, the second half of chapter 10 of the previous Rebbe's Maimer Basi Legani Tafshin Yud. We are talking about the second half of our Maimer, of the Rebbe's Maimer from Tafshin Chaf from 1960. So in the end here, the after we talked about in the beginning, the first half of chapter 10 and the first half of our Maimer, which is that through our Avodah, through the Jews' divine service, what he causes is both drawing down Soviv, the transcendent light, and up to Atzmas, the essence of God, as well as Mamale, the immanent light, the one that affects every individual level and creation in its own unique way. So the previous Rebbe then seemingly switches gears, but it's clearly he says that one flows into the next. He says the fact that that's what a Jew accomplishes through his divine service by making a home for God in this world. That's why the Jewish people are called Tzivos Hashem. And we're trying to understand what Tzivos Hashem means. What does it mean that they are the hosts, the army of God? So we introduced the previous Rebbe in his Maimer says that the word Tzivos has three meanings. One is like a soldier, a chayil, which we don't talk about in our Maimer. That we'll get to next in chapter 11 of the previous Maimer and the coming Basi Legani Maimer of the Rebbe. So that's not addressed, that's not defined and explained here in this Maimer. But the other two, he does explain. The first one is tzivyoin, that the word tzava comes from the word color, different shades and colors, something that's colorful. We explain what that means. And then the one that we're at now, the third interpretation of tzava, which is time, a set period of time. And so we introduced what is the significance of time. So the Rebbe brought in chapter 5 from the Tzemach Tzedek that it's vital that a person serves God every single day. Why do we have to serve God every single day? Because every single day, as we're engaged in the lowly world, our actions and our divine service is tainted by the lowliness of this world. And so every single day, a person has to go through the process of elevating their actions, of refining them, of cleaning them, of cleansing them and elevating them. And seemingly we have this idea encapsulates sort of everything we talked about, which is on the one hand, that a person has to serve God. On the other hand, that he elevates his actions, which is like we talked about in the first half of the Maimer, the idea that a person through the divine service, God rinses or cleanses the daughters of Zion, the verse we quoted from Isaiah, Rachatz Hashem b'nois Tzion. But the previous Rebbe's Maimer doesn't, and that explains also the verse that he brings, which is Yamim Yutzaru v'lo echad b'hem. So we spent some time talking about that verse, Yamim Yutzaru v'lo echad b'hem, but in brief, the way we interpret it is that God creates days, every specific day, and our mission, our job is v'lo echad b'hem, to take loy and bring it into the days. What does it mean to bring the loy into the days? So as we explained, loy is written in Tanakh. It is written one way. It's written lamed aleph, which means no or not, and then it's pronounced loy with a vav to him. And we explained the simple meaning of it. But here, with the way Chassidus explains it, the way the Rebbe explains it in the Maimer, the loy echad b'hem means that you take loy with an aleph. Loy, the not, meaning God as he's undefinable, as he's beyond the essence of Hashem, and you bring it loy into a vav, bring it into the divine days, into the divine attributes, down into our world as well. So we see that we draw through our service of elevating our actions and our deeds, which is specifically done through the process of prayer, the service of prayer. Through that, one draws the loy with an aleph, the divine essence, down into loy with a vav, into every single world. So we see that we're on one hand drawing the divine essence, and on the other hand we're bringing it down into the material world, into everyday life and into that space. But then we started the end of the last class. We started reading the first paragraph here of chapter 6, which is on page with the end of page Chav Dalet in the handout, which you can find in the chat here to the right side, at least on my right here, and in chapter 6, the Rebbe starts by quoting the next segment of the previous Rebbe's Maimer. So now the Rebbe is going to identify really three stages, once the previous Rebbe starts talking about tzava as in time, in chapter 10 of his Maimer, which is literally the last third or so of chapter 10 of his Maimer. So the Rebbe identifies three things. The first is what we just talked about, that tzava means that you have to, that we have to bring loy into echad into hem, into the days. So that's the idea of daily service. And that we discussed that, we explained it from the Tzemach Tzedek. But then in chapter 6, the Rebbe continues that the previous Rebbe goes back to something he had mentioned in previous chapters, which is that this is the meaning of a Jew making a home for God, taking the sheker, the lie that is that this world presents itself as independent, so to speak, from God. So that lie and that kesher, the attachment, that the doubling down on that lie, and the stubbornness that the world presents that lie with, transforming it into keresh, into a pillar for the Mishkan. So we talked about this, and we explained the issue here now in the end of last class, but just to review in brief, the Rebbe is saying here that based on what we just said from the Tzemach Tzedek, explaining this idea of drawing of divine service every single day, the importance of serving God every single day, davening every day, elevating our daily behavior and conduct through the process of prayer every day. That doesn't explain or doesn't really help us understand this next step that the previous Rebbe takes his point to, which is a return to this idea of kesher and sheker, the idea of transforming the falseness into a keresh, into a pillar. And as was discussed in previous chapters of the previous Rebbe's Maimer, specifically last year we talked about this, the idea that the pillars of the tabernacle, the purpose of a pillar is to connect the floor and the ceiling, meaning that the floor itself, as it's a floor, is connected, is attached, is one with the ceiling. But not that the floor becomes the ceiling. The floor is still a floor. Or put in other terms, the idea is to make a home for God in the lowest realms. So you can make a home for God in the lowest realms by transforming the lowest realms into higher realms, but then it's not a home in the lowest realm. The idea is, the challenge is, and the accomplishment, the achievement of making a dir b'tachtonim is that it's a dira, it's a home for God, but it's b'tachtonim, it's down here, as it remains down here, below. So, in other words, obviously, to make this world hospitable for God, it can't remain in its lowly state, meaning it's got to be sensitive to God, it's got to be hospitable to God, on the one hand. But on the other hand, it's still tachtonim, it's still lamata, it's still down here. It's still the physical, material world. Through prayer, a person elevates himself, elevates his actions, he becomes more spiritual. He climbs the ladder, like as we know, prayer is like the ladder that reaches up to heaven. A person climbs the ladder, he ascends up above, and he's no longer on the ground. But the idea is to make the home for God rooted in this world. So that's where we left off here in chapter 6, where the Rebbe now continues to explain that next section, where the previous Rebbe continues this thought about time and says that we're not just talking about time, that it's a daily service of God, but that the idea that this is the idea of connecting the floor and the ceiling, attaching the pillars, the atzei shitim oimdim, they mechabrim, they attach oir and soif, as we quote here from towards the end of chapter 10 of the Maimer, it attaches the floor with the ceiling. So now we're on page Chaf Hey in the handout, the second paragraph here of chapter 6. V'hinei. So since the objective is not only to cleanse, to elevate the actions of men, but also that the world's own existence should not be in a manner of sheker. It shouldn't exist as sheker, as a lie. But it should be in a manner of a keresh, a pillar of the home of God. Which this is done through kesher, through attaching the lie of this world with its true self, bringing it in tune with its own true essence, which is the truth of heaven, that its existence is truly God. So how do they move on? So it's understood that the world itself needs to be transformed. Not like we just quoted from the Tzemach Tzedek, which is that the actions are transformed, but the lowliness of the world remains, the world's lowliness remains low. There's still a situation where there's dirt, and every single day one has to cleanse his actions and lift them out of the mud. But here we're saying that no, there's got to be something else, which is that the mud itself has to change. The earthiness itself has to be transformed. Not just that something has to be elevated out of it, but it itself has to be transformed. So So how is this done? So he says like this, as explained by the Rebbe Marash by Mamorim, that he said after the birth and the bris of the Bala Ilula, of the one who's Hilula were observing Yud Shvat, the previous Rebbe, which is interesting. The Rebbe, here these last chapters of the Maimer, we're focusing on time, the significance of time, the importance of time. We're doing your service, divine service every day. Now we're focusing on another element of time, and then as we move forward, we're going to focus on specific time. So in the same nature, the same spirit of this conversation here, the Rebbe points out that he's quoting from the Rebbe Marash, but from a specific time. That the Rebbe Marash said this, and because everything and time itself, everything is significant. So this is an explanation that the Rebbe is quoting from the Rebbe Marash, which he said immediately after the birth, soon after the birth of the previous Rebbe. Yeah, so the Rebbe would always emphasize the importance of the time and the time that we're in, and the significance of that time. So fine. So the Rebbe Marash says like this. This is in his famous Hemshech, his series of Mamarim, which begin with Matzah Zu Tafresh Mem. So this is 140 years ago. And he says like this, he explains, he quotes the Gemara, where the Gemara says, Alma amai koim chulu. What does the world, what sustains the world? And the Gemara answers, that the world is sustained by the Yeheshmei Rabba of Agada, which means, Rashi explains there in the Gemara, that the sages had established that on Shabbos, when people aren't working, people have extra time, so they would gather in the shuls, and all the business people and the simple folk that weren't able to learn, that didn't really know how to learn, and had no time to learn during the week, they'd gather in the shuls, and they would learn together. What would they learn? They'd learn Agada. Agada is the ethical and really mystical teachings of the Talmud. So not so much the legal aspects of it, but more the inspirational, homiletic parts of the Talmud, which, as we know, the Agada of Talmud, the Alter Rebbe says that Reiv Soidis HaTorah Gnuzim, that Agada, the Agadic parts of the Talmud, what people sometimes call the legends of the Talmud, that those sections of the Talmud and Yaakov contain the deepest secrets of the Torah. So it's really it's mystical, almost a form of Kabbalah, you can call it. That's what they would sit and learn to inspire the people. After they would learn that, somebody would get up and say Kaddish. So there was a Kaddish that was said after this weekly learning session in the shuls. Practically, I think it probably also applies to Kaddish D'Rabbanan that we say during davening, which is said, Rabbanan's Kaddish is said after you learn, you read a passage from Torah Sheba'al Peh, either the Brisa of Rabbi Shmuel at the beginning of davening, or the Brisas at the end of davening, and the quotes from the Mishnah, the Gemara at the end of davening. So when we study some Mishnah, some of the oral law, when we study it afterwards, we say Kaddish D'Rabbanan. So that's the Yeheshmei Rabba of Agadata. So the Gemara asks, what does the world, what sustains the world? And the answer is it's sustained by the Yeheshmei Rabba of the Kaddish D'Rabbanan. So Tzarech Lahavin, so the Rebbe Marash asks like this. We have to understand, Ma'u Inyan Shai Alma Amai Koim. He wants to understand, what is the Gemara's question? What is the world? How does the world survive? We know that the world is sustained by the word of God that constantly reverberates in creation. God is constantly creating in a manner of, as we say in davening, that in his kindness, in his goodness, he renews every single day, constantly. At every moment of every day, he renews the works of creation. So God is constantly recreating the world with the same words he used to create it for the first time. And this is something that he does in his goodness all day, every day. So if that's the case, if God is constantly creating the world, so what's the Gemara's question? What sustains the world? The world is sustained by God constantly creating it. What's the question? So the Rebbe Marash explains there in those Mamarim, Alpi Mashakasav b'Maimer Azal Hanal Le'ilmine. He just widens the lens and says, we just quoted one passage in the Talmud, but if you back it up a couple of lines, the context in which this question is asked, the question is asked after a previous statement. Where the statement says, the Gemara says that since the destruction of the temple, every day brings more curses than the previous day. Now the Gemara over there talks about It says that one of the curses in where God talks in the Torah about what happens when we don't listen to Him, and it's a reference to the horrors of exile. So the verse says that at night the person's going to say, "Where's the morning? Where's the morning?" And in the morning he'll say, "Where's the evening? Who will provide morning? Who will provide evening?" So the Gemara says, what are we talking about? We're asking about the previous day. So since every day seems to be getting worse, so at night, suddenly night brings new horrors. So you mourn and you wish for the day that just passed. Seemingly when the morning comes and it brings again even new horrors, God forbid, so then the person misses the previous night. And so that's what it means when the verse says that the person will always be asking. At night he'll say, "Where's the day?" By day he'll say, "Where's the night?" What he's referring to is going backwards because the days and nights are getting, God forbid, progressively worse. So since that's the case, so based on this, the Gemara continues and says, once the Gemara establishes this idea that during the time of exile, the horrors will just keep getting worse and worse. So if that's the case, the Gemara says, so what will sustain the world? What is the question now? True God is constantly in His kindness and His goodness recreating the world at every moment. But nevertheless, since every day brings new problems, what does the world? What sustains the world? But what does that mean? What does the world kaim? What does it mean what does the world stand on? What does it mean that the word tekuma, the word kaim? What is the world? What sustains the world? Not that the world will revert to nothingness or that the world will cease to exist because of all the horrors. We know that God is constantly creating the world. But since every day is bringing more and more trouble, so the question becomes, is it possible, Alma Mai Koim, is it possible for the world to pick itself up, to be elevated? The pasuk in Parshas Chayesara, where it talks about Avram purchasing the Maras Machpelah in Hebron from Ephron. So he purchases the field and the cave. And then it says, after this purchase is consummated, it says, "Vayakom stay Ephraim," that the field of Ephraim was lifted up. What does it mean? It was lifted up. Real property doesn't move; it's stationary. So Rashi says, "Vayakom." What does it mean that it got up? Not that the field literally arose, but that Tukuma Haisala, the field was sort of elevated in status. It was elevated. It went from being owned by a commoner to being owned by Avraham Avinu, the father of all of humanity, of all of the nations. So the field status was elevated. That's what it means. So when the Gemara is asking here, Alma Mai Koim, the Gemara is asking, if things seem to be getting progressively worse, is it possible for the world to lift itself up? Is it possible for the world to be elevated, to be enhanced? That's the question. And for this, in order for the world to be elevated, to be sustained, not that it should be sustained, that it should exist, but that it should be elevated, it should thrive. For that, we need the Amen Yehi Shmei Rabba of Agadata. What does this mean? Shmei Rabba u'bechina Shmei Agadol. When we say, really in any context, you say Yehi Shmei Rabba Mevarach, right? We say, may the great name, Yehi Shmei Rabba, the great name of God, be blessed. About what exactly that means, but that's not today's topic. But the point is, certainly we're talking about Shmei Rabba, the great name of God. What is Shmei Rabba, the great name of God? That's Shmei HaGadol, his great name, which is the four-letter name of God, Yud Kei Vav Kei. The name that we talked about earlier, the name that goes with all the other names we talked about earlier in the Maimer. The greatest of all the names. The ineffable name of God, Shalom Ma'ila Mizayin Shem Shem Shem, which is higher than the 7 names that are not erased. It's the name of God that transcends all of those names. So it's the name of God that transcends the divine names. And as we said earlier in the Maimer, we're talking about sort of alluding almost up to the point of God's essence. And how is it accessed? How is it? We say Amen. We affirm. We validate. Shmei Rabba. We draw it. We take this Shmei Rabba. We draw it down into this world. How is that done? In other words, We say Amen Yehesh Rabba for all Kadeshim. Every Kaddish, you say Amen Yehesh Rabba. But the Gemara says that the elevation of the world happens specifically through the Yehesh Rabba that one says in Kaddish Derabban, the Kaddish that follows Agadata, studying that specific, the mystical parts of Torah. Right? So that's what Rebbe is saying. It happens, this is still from their Marash. This means the secrets and the inner dimension of Torah, as the Rebbe Marash elaborates at length in his mimer there. So that's the first thing that we're quoting here from the Rebbe Marash. But then he continues, but he adds another element to this. This idea that the world, that things seem to be getting progressively worse since the destruction of the temple, this is a reality in this world. That's the reality of the world. That's the trend. Things are trending in that direction, and that's the way the world is sort of evolving. And yet, but through the Amen Yesh Meirabba of Agadata that follows the studying of Chassidus, of Pnimis HaTorah, of the inner dimension of Torah, through that we change the trajectory, we change that reality. So what does it mean that the Yesh Meirabba of Agadata, that is what enhanced that element of the world? So he says, number one, we're saying that when we say Amen Yehesh Meirabba, after studying his secrets of Torah, we're accessing Shmaya Gadol, the divine name of God that's totally transcendent, and we're drawing it down into this world. And the result of that is that the world itself is transformed. How is that? What is this? Or how do we see this? So he explains. So to explain this, the Rebbe Marash, again, in his series, talks about this idea like this. He says, introduces the notion of, two quotes here, really about the same thing, one from the Gemara, one from the Medrash, where it talks about when Mashiach comes, the time of the resurrection of the dead. So it says that what will cause the resurrection, what will bring about the resurrection, when a person studies Torah in their lifetime, so then the light of Torah, or the dew of Torah, the effects of their Torah study is what will revive them, will resurrect them. Yeah, but the Rebbe Marash explains it a little differently. He says like this: the Inyan that the light of Torah will revive him, and Tal Torah Mechayehu, the dew of Torah will revive him. Shepirish Mechayehu, what is the meaning of that? It will revive him, or enliven him. Hainu beguf gamba ilam haza b'yosei chaya pnei adam. He says this is not only talking about in the time of the resurrection, but this is talking about even now during a person's lifetime. That during his lifetime he will be enlivened by the Torah he studies. This is the meaning of Torah. The light of Torah. The Torah is light, and by studying Torah, you bring that light into the world in a very tangible way. As we can see with our own eyes, that you can't compare the ray of the light of the face of a person who studies Torah. They become more radiant. They're physically more radiant. Like the Rambam writes, the Rambam writes that a person, you can tell from his demeanor, from his comportment, the way he carries himself, you could tell what's going on inside. You can tell what type of person he is. How is it possible that you could know what kind of person he is by looking at his extremity, looking at the way he carries himself, looking at his complexion, the way he appears, his appearance? But he says, it's because the light of the Torah that he studies shines, is effused from him. It shines out of him. In other words, that it impacts, and this impact is actually felt and noticed in the world. It changes the reality. So a person who studies Torah, his own body changes. The light of the Torah that he studies, that behavior is something that shines through him. It shines out of him, that you should be able to see it. So when other people, it affects him, his own body. It also affects the environment that he's in. When you're in the environment of greatness, you feel it. When you're in the environment of a holy person or a big Torah scholar, the air around them is different. So you see that through Torah study, we have that ability to change the world as it is. The person doesn't take on a different appearance. A person who studies Torah doesn't take on the form of an angel. He doesn't become a spiritual being. He's still a human being in a physical body. And yet the body starts to radiate the light of that Torah. So the body goes from being a material body, a physical body that conceals the radiance of the soul, to suddenly becoming a body that shines, that projects the light of the soul. So this then is what the Rebbe has mentioned, the previous Rebbe mentions at the end of his Maimer, that the effect is in the lies of the world itself. In other words, in the very nature of existence, in order to transform the nature of the existence of the world, and to bring about a connection of it with its true existence as it is from above, to the point that it becomes a keresh, it becomes a pillar that becomes now able to house the divine presence. So this is now the second element of time. We introduced again tzava, and we said tzava is time. So the first thing we explained was about bringing time, that we have to serve God daily, and that the function of serving God every day is that we elevate, specifically through prayer, we elevate our actions, our deeds. We can cleanse the dirt that attaches itself and becomes intertwined with our divine service. And through doing that, we draw godliness into it. So we said that on the one hand, we are affecting change even in a place where there's dirt, but the problem is we're lifting ourselves out of that place. So for that, the previous Rebbe continues in his Maimer, as the Rebbe clarifies here and develops, that we also transform it, that the sheker itself becomes keresh, that the very physical thing that was the obstacle, that we would say was the dirt, that itself becomes transformed. What we looked at before as dirt now becomes a pillar, now becomes a beam to house the Shekhinah. How does that happen? That happens through the Amen Yeshmi Rabba Vagadita, that the effect of Torah is such that it transforms the very nature of the material existence as well. So that's the second point that we learn from this idea of time. And now the Rebbe continues, chapter 7. Now in chapter 7, we're going to quote now this first paragraph, we're going to quote literally the last 3 lines of chapter 10 of the previous Rebbe's Maimer, and that's going to be, we're in the top of page Chavav in the handout. So we're now going to read the last 3 lines of chapter 10 of the previous Rebbe's Maimer, and the Rebbe is going to explain what they are now coming to add as well. So one last point about this idea of time. So Messiah Maimer, the previous Rebbe concludes in his Maimer. So this is the conclusion both of chapter 10 and also of the first half of the series, as we discussed earlier. The first half of the series of 4 Mamarim of Basi Legani of the previous Rebbe. So he says like this. So he concludes, the this, for this reason, the Jewish people are called Tzivis Havaya. They reveal and draw the revelation of Havaya. And Sava, the word Sava, why they're called Tzivas Havaya, is Zman Mugbal, is a limited time. The Kol Avidas Masher Vayamim Yutzaru, Shenitan L'chol Echad V'Echad, that all of their divine service in the days that were fashioned, that were created, that were given to every single individual, Yiyah Loi Echad. What does it mean, Yiyah Loi Echad? It should have that Echad, Sheyor V'Yizgal Aidei Avidasai B'chinas Havaya Echad. That every single one of these days, or through a person's avodah, his divine service, and every single one of these days, he brings the loy echad, he brings into them and into himself and into the world echad, the idea of God's oneness. So seemingly the previous Rebbe here is going back to something mentioned earlier. It just seems to be a little repetitive, but here he actually spells it out clear, and this is what the Rebbe wants to focus on. That at the end of chapter 10, the previous Rebbe goes back and says that Tzava is man mugbal. That Tzava, as we're translating it to mean time, that the time is a limited time. So when he introduces this idea of Tzivus Hashem, previous Rebbe, when he introduces it in his chapter 10, he says that the second interpretation of the word Tzava is Zman Mugbal, limited time. And then he goes on to explain the limit. When we said limited time, so you can mean limited time, you have a limited amount of time in this world. A person has limited days, and the idea is to fill every one of the days you have here. But then he returns again to this point and says that Tzava is man mugbal, it's a limited time. Why did the emphasis again returning to this idea of limited time? So here, the Rebbe is going to explain why the emphasis on limited time. Let's continue. Who's man mugbal dafka, so we can explain what it means when he says that Sava is man mugbal as a limited amount of time. It's possible for time to be non-limited. This is the idea of ratzei v'shayv, of coming and going, or going and coming, or and its source is mati and v'loy mati, desiring and not desiring. What does this mean? We've been talking about time. We know that time, as we know time, is limited. Time is basically a measurement of changes in reality, and there's past and present and future. And time is basically movement, something that moves from past to present to future. The concept of time we see is really is best expressed by a pendulum, though, right? The pendulum that moves back and forth. So as it moves back and forth, this is a sort of a measurement of time. It was here, and now it's there, and now it's back here, and that's how we see that time is moving. So the source of time is in when God creates. How is it that what is this? Everything is sourced in the divine, and God obviously exists outside of time and beyond time. So what's the source of time? So time is really embedded in the nature of existence, of created existence. Why? Because when God creates the world, He creates it in a manner of ratzei v'shayv. Ratzei v'shayv. Ratzei means to go. Shayv means to return. The term comes from the vision of Ezekiel, where he talks about the angels that he sees. V'chayis ratzei v'shayv. He sees angels going back and forth in their sort of in the divine worship. They're going back and forth. But really, this idea is that they do that. There's also a manifestation of something beyond them in their source, which is that God creates the world in a manner of ratzei v'shayv. That the divine energy that creates and sustains goes in two ways. It goes and it comes. What does it mean that it goes and it comes? In order for God to create something outside of Himself, so to speak, so He extends His light into the creation. The problem is, as the light goes into creation, it's no longer, the further it goes, the less it might feel its source. So the light needs to retreat, needs to go back into its source, to be energized, to be recharged. And that's the idea of the light being ratzei v'shayv, going back and forth, meaning it's a movement to create, and then it needs to go back into its source where it retains that energy to be able to create. And that's how it goes back and forth. This idea of going back and forth is like the pendulum that swings, right? Back and forth. And that's the idea of, from that, we have the notion of time, of a past and a future. It was in one space and now it's in another place, and back and forth. This movement is the measurement that we call that eventually is what we come to know as time. But when we talk about ratzei v'shayv in the divine energy, so on the one hand we're saying it's ratzei v'shayv, it goes back and forth, it goes out to create, then it comes back into its source, and back and forth. But it's not happening in stages. These two ideas happen sort of simultaneously. And so you can't really call it time. It's the source of time. From that, we have time. The pendulum is on one side, then it's on the other side. It swings back and forth, and it's in one place at one time and another place at another time. It's not both places simultaneously. But, so the idea of ratzei v'shayv is in a sense a source of time, but it's in a sense infinite time. Meaning it's time not as it's limited to past and future. It's time sort of in concept, but not in actuality. So that's sort of infinite time. The same is true, really, the application of ratzei v'shayv within human beings. We know it talks about a lot, and Chassidus talks about the avodah, the divine service has to be in a manner of ratzei v'shayv, where we, on the one hand, we have to yearn to detach ourselves, to raise ourselves up out of this world, to free ourselves from the limitations, the strictures of this world, to just connect and to cleave to the divine, to connect to God. And at the same time, we have to remember that we can't do that. We have to remain true to our mission. God put us in this world to do something, to accomplish something. So we have to remain grounded and rooted in this world and in this life. And the truth is, you need both components. In order to fulfill your mission in this world, a person has to always desire to get out of it. In other words, to connect to his source. And the more you want to connect to your source, that invigorates you so that when you remain down here in this world, you're now committed to your service. If you remain too grounded in this world without a desire to rise above it, then it's easy to forget what your mission is, to lose your way in this world. And so we have these two dueling sort of movements, one to cleave, to depart from the body, and to cleave to God, to reunite with our source, and on the other hand, to remain true to our mission. When do these things play out? So in time, they don't have to play out. They don't have to play out consecutive. They can be simultaneous. That at one point, a person can both be grounded and rooted in fulfilling his purpose, and at the same time, desire to be somewhere else. Yet there's still two different movements. One is a movement to retreat back to the source, and the other one's a movement to remain grounded in the here and now, in the present. So the source of Ratzi V'Shoiv, because Ratzi V'Shoiv as well, that's already as God creates. So as God sort of extends his creative energy outward into a space of creation, so here you have the Ratzi V'Shoiv, the back and forth. The source of Ratzi V'Shoiv, of this back and forth sort of energy, is Mati V'Loi Mati. What's Mati V'Loi Mati? Mati V'Loi Mati means desire and non-desire. In other words, before God actually makes a move to create, as he simply is sort of contemplating, let's say, creation. So there's a space where God desires to create, and a desire is also, you can call it a movement. When a person has a desire, it's sort of an expression of the soul. So it's a movement of the soul. The soul is now reaching out to something else, the object of its desire. So there's the soul as it desires, or the person as he desires, which is a movement towards something. But then there is, as the soul doesn't desire anything, as it remains completely on its own without any desire. So without any movement, so to speak. This is already a step higher than Ratzi V'Shoiv, than going back and forth. Ratzi V'Shoiv is already a movement towards something, a movement away from something. You could almost call it even like an emotional movement and retreat back and forth. An emotional roller coaster that you go on, which has ups and downs. Mati V'Loi Mati is already no ups and downs. You're not in a roller coaster. That's all within the soul itself. But the soul is in a state of desire, and the soul is in a state of non-desire. So that's Mati V'Loi Mati. From God's sort of two states, the idea of in a state of desire, not desire, is all in the same soul. It's all in the same essence, same core of God. And so here already, there isn't coming and going back and forth. It's all within that oneness. So Mati V'Loi Mati gives rise to Ratzi V'Shoiv. That when God actually goes out to start creating, so to speak, you have this Ratzi V'Shoiv, back and forth. But even here, this idea of Mati V'Loi Mati and Ratzi V'Shoiv are in a sense spiritual time, meaning infinite, or in other words, infinite time. Infinite time meaning that they're not limited, they're not confined to a past and a present and a future. And the same is true. We can talk about time as it plays out, practically past, present, and future, or we can apply it even, let's say, in our own lives, our own divine service. There's the concept of infinite time, which is that a person is constantly in with two movements, in a state of desire, a yearning to go out, to transcend, and in a state of remaining grounded. We can call that spiritual time because it's two movements, but it's infinite time. It's not a limited time. It's not limited and it's not confined time. But the previous Rebbe, in the end of his Maimer, says, no, that Sava is Zman Mugbal, limited time. So we're not talking about spiritual time. And the truth is, even what we said before in chapters 5 and 6, we can interpret them in a sense as spiritual time, because we're talking about divine service, spiritual service. So there's the idea of daily service. So yeah, we have to put it in every single day. But the idea is that we're rising, and that's something that's not confined. It's not defined by the constraints of time, by the limitation of time. So yeah, we have to fill every single day, but it's really a notion of time that's more abstract. It's a notion of time that's more infinite, not more, but that is infinite. That's spiritual. But the previous Rebbe at the end of his Maimer comes back and makes the emphasis: no, that when we talk about time, we're talking about Zman Mugbal. We're talking about limited time. Time in the way we understand, we conceive of the concept of time, which is limited. Time as it's limited. That's just a little background to that'll form the foundation to what we're going to say in the rest of chapter 7, which we will continue, God willing, in the next class.